Well, when I read over that short passage, Matthew 20, verses 29 to 34, when I read over that passage about these two blind men, I did wonder what would be the best way to approach it. And I really just concluded that the best thing to do would be just to deal with the narrative itself first, and then, secondly, seek to draw out some applications from that. So then, as you'll recall, Jesus was on his way to Jerusalem. Jericho was a city that was on the way there. You may remember, of course, that Jericho was the first city that the Israelites conquered rather dramatically when they entered the Promised Land. Anyway, there it was, just across the River Jordan, about 6 or 7 miles from the Dead Sea. And from there, from Jericho, it was a further 15 miles to Jerusalem, but it was all uphill. It was about 3,500 feet upwards. Now, Matthew, he tells us that the event that we just read of took place as they were leaving Jericho. In verse 29 it says, "And as they departed from Jericho, a great multitude followed him." Now, it is probably just worth mentioning that when Luke records this account, he suggests that they were on their way into Jericho. He says, "And it came to pass that as he was come nigh unto Jericho." Now, I know that the skeptics will be saying, "Oh, well, that's just the Bible contradicting itself again." But for anybody that's, willing to engage their mind just for a few minutes, there are other answers that don't involve any contradiction whatsoever. And one of them has to do with the meaning of the Greek word that's translated "come nigh" in Luke, because that may simply mean "in the vicinity of," which of course, if they're just leaving Jericho, they're still in the vicinity of it. You can look that up in any concordance and you'll see I'm not saying anything outrageous, so it could mean that. But what I would say was even more likely is that Luke just gives us a more full account of the event. So these men then, they are at one end of the city, and when they hear that Jesus has come, they call out, and while they are following the crowd, they continue shouting out to Jesus from behind until they get to the other side when Jesus answered them. Now, of course, you might ask, well, these blind men, how are they going to know where to go if that's the case? But in a crowd, that would not be very difficult. It would not be very difficult for blind people to follow a crowd. And I think that's probably what happened. They were sat at one end, Jesus came in and they followed until Jesus answered them on the way out. Now, Mark, he tells us that the name of one of these men was Bartimaeus. He says, Bartimaeus, the son of Timaeus. Now, the name Bartimaeus means son of Timaeus. So the Bible is going out of its way, we might say, just to let us know who this particular individual is. And I suspect then that he was rather well known in Jericho, and the other one perhaps not so well known. And if so, that may well be why both Mark and Luke concentrate on the one rather than both of them. There we are. That's sort of the scene, if you like. Jesus, he's passing through Jericho, and then here they are, these two blind men. They're just sitting by the roadside, and they would have been begging. And they become aware of something of a commotion going on all around them. And they ask, what's going on? What's happening? And they're told, Jesus is passing through. And quite obviously, Jesus' fame was such that probably most of the town turned out to see him. Certainly it was a name that these blind men were not unaware of, because they cry out, we read it in verse 30, "Have mercy on us, O Lord, thou Son of David." They realise that if anyone can help them, then it is Jesus the Messiah. And so they call out to him. They call out to him for mercy. And if anyone doubts that they thought that Jesus was the Messiah, then we can only ask, why were the chief priests and scribes so indignant when children use that very term, Son of David, of Jesus, a little later? It'll be in chapter 21, we'll come across that. These blind men, they knew who Jesus was. They had sufficient knowledge to know that he was the Messiah and that he could help them. And then as to the mercy for which they plead, it's not mercy as opposed to judgment, it's compassion and kindness in relation to their condition that they are after. So they're shouting out for mercy, and the people around them, well, they tell it, be quiet, hush up. And they say to them, who do you think you are, calling upon this great prophet like that? But the blind men, they won't be put off. They just cry out the same thing, all the louder. They don't change what they want, they don't change their words. They are just presumably more vehement in their cries, louder in their pleas, as I say. Now, of course, that in itself is a lesson for all of us, that if we do not get an answer to our prayers immediately, we should not give up. We should not give up. Rather, we should be all the more insistent and urgent in our requests. And so it is then that Jesus comes to a halt and he asks them what it is that they want. And they reply, "Lord, that our eyes may be opened." And immediately he gives them their sight. There was no pause, there was no interruption. The blind men, they didn't have to wait any longer. Immediately they were healed. They received their sight and they followed Jesus. Now, anybody that has experienced the compassion and power of Jesus will follow him. And that's what these two did. So that's the event itself. But what are our lessons then from this? Well, let's just think again about these two men. They're sitting by the wayside, they're begging. Now, I know Matthew doesn't tell us that that's what they were doing, but the other accounts do. They can't see a thing. They're in total darkness. And along comes Jesus on his way to Jerusalem. Now, because we know why he's going to Jerusalem, we might think that his thoughts would be taken up with his imminent suffering and death. But no, he shows concern for these blind men. And not only is he concerned for these men, but he does something for them. He gives them their sight. Now that must have been very hard to imagine what that was like for those two men. To be always in total darkness, having no idea what things really look like, and then all of a sudden you are filled with the sight of all things resplendent in the glory that light gives to them. That must have been such a wonderful moment for those two men. But what I want us to do is to consider the application of this account to those of you who are not a Christian. I don't want to be too fanciful about this, but this account does give us a beautiful picture of mankind in our natural condition, and of course then the remedy for our ills. For anybody who is not a Christian today, then the reality is that you are blind. Now, I know that nobody likes to be told that they are blind. No one likes to be called blind. There were the Pharisees, for instance, that we read of in John 9, verses 39 to 41. There we read, Jesus said, "For judgment I am come into this world, that they which see not might see, and that they which see might be made blind. And some of the Pharisees which were with him heard these words, and said unto him, Are we blind also? And Jesus said unto them, If ye were blind, ye should have no sin. But now ye say, We see, therefore your sin remaineth." Well, nobody likes to be told they are blind. But you see, it's a most important thing to recognise this fact. By nature, we are all like these blind men. That's true for every human being that's in their natural condition. Because to be spiritually blind means to be unable to see things as they truly are. To be unable to know God. To be unable to know ourselves truly and fully. You know, if a physically blind person stands facing a mirror, they will not be able to see what they look like. They can stand there forever and they will never know exactly what they look like. And so it is also with spiritual blindness. But we are like these two men in another way as well. Now remember, they were begging. That was their lot. Their blindness had reduced them to a beggarly condition. Now, it might seem a bit weird, especially in our day, to say that we are like beggars. After all, do we not live in nice houses? Don't we have jobs if we want them? Don't we go on nice holidays, etc., etc.? And yet, in the things that matter, we are poor. You know, Jesus makes a very telling comparison between earthly treasure and heavenly treasure. He said, "Lay not up for yourselves treasures upon earth, where moth and rust doth corrupt, and where thieves break through and steal. But lay up for yourselves treasures in heaven, where neither moth nor rust doth corrupt, and where thieves do not break through nor steal." The reality is our earthly treasure is transient. It comes and it goes. Imagine yourself shipwrecked on an island, just stranded on this desert island. You're the only one there. And you discover vast quantities of gold and jewels. And yet you're alone. So whatever your perceived value of those jewels and gold may be, they are actually worth nothing to you. And then, say, eventually a boat comes past and you are rescued, but you're told you can't bring the gold and jewels on the boat. There simply isn't enough room. There's just enough room for you. Well, that is what earthly treasures are like. It is of little real value, and it certainly does not last forever. So this is mankind's condition. Originally created to enjoy an eternal, beautiful relationship with God, but reduced to scrabbling about in the dirt and living on handouts. Well, so it was for these two, sitting by the roadside, probably getting covered in the dirt and dust that's been raised by the crowd. As we've noted, these two must have heard about Jesus. Otherwise, why would they have called out the way that they did? And so it is for you. For those of you here, those of you listening to this, if you didn't know something about Jesus, you probably wouldn't be here. It's possible that you know nothing about him, but you will have come expecting to hear about him. Perhaps it's just curiosity, but you know that there is something special about Jesus. So just like these blind men, if this is your case, you should cry out for mercy. Because the thing is, Jesus is close to us now. Wherever you may be, he is close. He is. Now, true enough, you can't see him, but then neither could these two men in Jericho. And of course, to be fair to you, it's not your spiritual blindness that prevents you from seeing him with your eyes, because none of us can actually see him. But your spiritual blindness does prevent you from knowing he is here. Again, I draw your attention back to these blind men sitting there, hoping for a bumper begging day. They could have thought something like, well, how can we really know this is Jesus coming along? We can't see him. Could be anybody. But they don't. They don't think like that. They don't wallow in such thoughts. They hear that it is Jesus, and perhaps they think, well, maybe Jesus will never come this way again, as indeed he didn't for them. And as we said, as we've seen, they know something of his power. Son of David, as we've noted, is a messianic title. And they, as it were, they come to their senses and they call out for mercy. And what they did, I say, you should do as well. And you might say, well, won't he always be near? Well, there is one sense, of course, in which he will always be near. But you'll be surprised at how quickly your thoughts can be turned aside, how readily the attractions of the world will cloud your judgments, how easily you will forget you have a need. And so the crowd, wrongly, they indicate that Jesus won't want anything to do with these blind beggars. It's quite likely that there were those among such people who would say to the beggars something like, oh, please, you don't want to get involved with this fanatic. You're better off as you are. You need to accumulate wealth in whatever way you can. This guy tells you not to worry about it and indeed to give it away. And that's sort of indicative of the responses that you're likely to face when you call out for mercy. Perhaps it will be from some inner debate, or more likely from those that you know. Or perhaps you think, or might be told, that you just, you're not good enough to be a Christian. My friends, none of us are good enough to be Christians. But that's the point. Jesus did not come to earth to gather the great and good to himself, because there are no such people. Jesus came to redeem sinners. That is, he came to pay the price of their sin by suffering the punishment in their place. And that is what the crucifixion was all about. It wasn't the triumph of the bad guys over the good. It wasn't some gesture just to show us that he understands and is with us in our suffering. He died a sacrificial death. He stood condemned in the sight of God because he took the sin of others on himself so that they would not have to bear it. And so, if you're harbouring any thoughts about not being good enough, well, I say, well, you're right, you're not. But in that is the assurance, because it was for such people that Christ died. But then maybe you're thinking, the opposite of that. Maybe you're thinking, well, I lead a good life. I've never hurt anybody, well, at least not to my knowledge. I don't think I need all that religious stuff. It only causes trouble. Atheists are good people as well, But the problem is you do have the need. No matter how good you think you are, you most certainly are not good enough for God, because he demands perfection. There's no half measures. He demands perfection. And then, of course, that comment that so many people do make about religion only causing trouble, it simply helps to prove the point that all people by nature have such wicked hearts that they can take even that which is intended for good and turn it to wicked ends. And of course, we also have to say that although Christianity may rightly be called a religion, it's not so in the sense of rites and ceremonies that we generally associate with the word religion. Christianity is all about coming into a living, loving relationship with Jesus. So don't be fooled. You are neither so bad that you cannot be saved, but neither are you so good that you don't need to be saved. Don't let empty reasoning prevent you from calling on Jesus. Because you see, from the example of these two men, Jesus does respond to our cries. It's easy to think that he would have no interest in us, especially when we can't even see him. We might think, well, are we just calling out into thin air? But what we see is that he does hear people when they cry out to him. There's no reason to think that if you call, he will not hear you. He not only hears, but he responds. And as you consider this account, it is lovely to realise that he called these two men. No doubt there was a reasonable sized throng round about. Now, among such a number, it's not hard to think that there were others that had various needs as well. But he calls the ones who have been crying out for mercy. And is interested in us as individuals. So often we are reduced to a state's insurance number, a bank account number, a driving license number. But Jesus is concerned for the individual. Jesus does not ignore anybody that cries out to him. Now, make no mistake about this. Jesus is well able to give you what you need. People before Jesus and after, they performed miracles, but nobody did it with the ease and regularity that he did. He's well able to provide what you need. And the reason is that Jesus is no ordinary man. Now, he is a man, he's true man, but he is God in the flesh. It is often said today that the most powerful man on earth is the President of the USA. Certainly he does wield great power. But that is nothing in comparison to the power of the Lord Jesus Christ, who simply with a word causes the blind to see, the lame to walk, and the dead to rise again. And as I've said, you have a need. In fact, I suspect you have many needs. But your greatest need, if you are not a Christian this day, is your need of salvation. You need to seek God's forgiveness for your sin, for your rebellion against him. You need to be turned from being God's enemy to being God's friend. And only Jesus can do this. And not only can he do it, but as we've seen, he's most willing to do so. Now, while Matthew records what Jesus did for these men, he said, Luke tells us what he said to them. He said, "Receive thy sight, thy faith hath saved thee." Now, I cannot overstate the importance of faith. It says in the Bible, without faith, it is impossible to please God. So that gives you an idea of just how important faith is. But faith is not some strange ability to believe the unbelievable. Faith is actively trusting God. There was no doubt in the mind of these two that Jesus could make them see. And if you come to him in the same spirit, you too will receive what you need. It all sounds too easy. But don't let its apparent ease put you off. So many people think that they must do something to gain entrance into heaven. It can come as something of a shock to realise that not only do you not need to do anything, but there is actually nothing that you can do that will make you ready for heaven. Faith is the key. Trust in another and not yourself. See yourself as you really are and call on Jesus to save you from your sin. That way is the only way to be made right in God's sight. And then finally, let me just end with a word of warning to any who think that they can use the easiness of the way of salvation as a kind of insurance policy. Something to keep in reserve in case it is needed sometime. That sort of an emergency break glass kind of thing. Genuine faith has an effect. It has an outworking. Those blind men, they followed Jesus. If we have been saved by Jesus, we don't think, well, that's a good job well done. No, we follow him in the way. We learn from him and we seek to put into practice those things that we learn. Christianity is not a Sunday religion. It is a lifelong commitment. Now, I don't tell you this to lay any extra burden on you, just so you may know that the genuineness of your faith can be seen. As Jesus elsewhere said, "He that is forgiven much will love much." It's something that can be seen. So call now. Call on him to give you what you need. Call on him to forgive you your sins, to make you whole, and to grant you to see that you may follow him all the days of your life until he leads you on into heaven, where faith will no longer be needed and you will see him in all his glory and majesty. This matter is so very important. Do not leave it for another day. Amen.